Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Goldmark, Professor of Music and Interim Director of the Baker-Nord Center for the Humanities. Thank you for joining us. Sorry for the delay. Thank you for joining us for the last in our series of 7 virtual lectures this fall. All of our previous talks from this semester, including this one, can be found online at the Baker-Nord website. For information on this and all of our upcoming events for spring 2021, please visit bakernord.case.edu. It's my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jeremy Bendik-Keymer, Associate Professor of Philosophy, Elmer G. Beamer, Hubert H. Schneider, Professor in Ethics, and Senior Research Fellow on the Earth Science Governance Project. His talk today is To Be Held and to Be Seen, Love's Moral Core and the Security of Wondering. Professor Bendik-Keymer.
I want to thank the Baker-Nord Center and Maggie and Daniel and also Media Vision for helping us today with this talk. It's obviously it's a really crazy day today in Northeast Ohio with the storm. So I hope everyone's doing okay with this and all the other things that are going on in the world right now. All right, I'll just dig in. This is a pretty standard philosophy talk. There'll be moments that are, I hope, quite clear, and there will be some moments that are a little bit technical. That's kind of what you get with an academic talk, and I hope you'll bear with me through the moments that are a little more technical. I start my public talks with a land acknowledgement. I think it's important, so I'm going to do that, and then I'm just going to dig right in. And I look forward to getting any questions later after the talk is done. All right, so Case Western Reserve resides on the ancestral lands of the Lenape, Delaware, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Shawnee, Wyandot, Miami, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the other Great Lakes tribes, the Chippewa, the Kickapoo, the Waya, the Pinakashaw, and the Kaskaskia. This land of the Northwest Territory was ceded under force from the U.S. military by 1,100 chiefs and warriors signing the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. Subsequently, the treaty wasn't honored by the United States of America, just as all 374 treaties with Native Americans ratified by the U.S. Senate have not been. Today, there are nearly 28,000 Native American people who live in Northeast Ohio, your neighbors, co-workers, classmates, and community members, and they represent over 100 tribal nations. Okay, here goes. It's 3 a.m., and Misty and I are whispering in bed so as not to wake up Emmett across the hallway sleeping. Misty went to bed early last night so as to catch up on sleep, and I did my best to conk out when I could too. This is our brief catch-up that we would have had if we had gone to bed together and talked before turning out the light. Misty's body is sore. We've been caring for a baby all year, but she more than me, given that she's been breastfeeding. I put pressure on her wrists, elbows, shoulders, and neck as we talk. It takes some of the soreness out by taking some of the stiffness out. More than anything, I feel, human touch evaporates the stress, and Misty feels lighter and talks with more freedom in her voice. I also want to connect with her for no other reason than to connect. Now, philosophers might ask, what am I showing in connecting with Misty in these ways? Talking, touching, relieving some pain. One thought developed by the influential Berkeley professor Nico Kolodny in his important 2003 article, Love as Valuing a Relationship, is that I am valuing both Misty and our relationship appropriately. Love, he claims, consists in this proper valuing and, quote, in seeing the relationship as a reason for valuing it and one's partner. There are 2 ideas here that are conjoined to make up the substance of love. An idea about what we should consider when we act, and an idea about how we should view things in love. So let me start with the first. This is going to be technical for a minute, but we'll get there. It'll be clearer later. When Kolodny speaks of a reason to act, he means a good reason, all things being equal. A good reason to act is simply a consideration in favor of some course of action that, all things being equal, should be sufficient to make us decide on it and to justify our decision. Kolodny's first idea about love appears to be that the relationship that, say, you and your loved one have, let us call it your union, gives each of you a reason to value each other in specific ways. In other words, your union gives you a reason to act in certain ways that show you are worthy to each other, that is valuable. Your union gives you a sufficient reason, all things being equal, to show in your actions that both each other and your union together matter and are worthwhile. One half of love consists then in considering how you should act in ways that reflect the value of your union and each other. One half of love is being reasonable in light of the value of the union and each other. The second idea is that in love, we should both view one another and our relationship as worthwhile and valuable. Clodney is clear that the way each in love and their relationship should be seen as valuable is as what's called non-instrumental. What this might seem to mean is that Misty shouldn't be seen as a mere tool for my purposes, and nor should our relationship be seen merely as something useful. We can be useful for each other. I can squeeze Misty's wrist to relieve some pressure from often lifting our son, Emmett, but she shouldn't see me as merely good insofar as I do things like that. I should matter to her and she to me for who she is and not for what she does for me. Similarly, our union can be a great help. For instance, in raising Emmett with a strong bond for him to internalize as his childhood cosmos, but it shouldn't matter only for its usefulness. It should matter as a way to live, period. Now, there's much to be said for Clodney's view, but also much to be puzzled about. Certainly in love, we should each matter to each other for who we are, not just what we do for each other, and our relationship should be a way to live, period. Clodney's also right that love should involve seeing our relationship as a justification for living the way that we do, quote unquote, because we're partners. Our relationship should also guide our making decisions, showing how we matter to each other, even in the dead of night, because Misty is my partner. But the strangeness and inadequacy of Clodney's view appears shortly thereafter. To begin with, to carve up love into two halves, one a way of valuing and the other way of justifying and orienting one's actions, is, to put it mildly, I think, way off. The essence of love is not seen in these two things, and there are many more things of which love consists than valuing, justifying, and orienting action. So that I'm clear up front, let me just say that although evaluation is sometimes part of loving, love cannot be at heart a matter of sizing things up to figure out what is good. That's one thought past where love is. Love's more basic than evaluation. In love, we become singular people to each other with our lives joined to or multi-wise. Evaluation only proceeds on the basis of that and is a subsidiary aim of what love's about. Secondly, although love can orient and justify one's actions in some cases, love isn't even about acting in the first place. It's about connecting. As a result of these two fundamental disagreements that I have, Clodney's practical account of love as a relationship doesn't actually get the way that love is relational. So let me explain my points in some detail now. I'll begin with, and this is the most technical part of the talk, I'll begin with Clodney's emphasis on the love relationship giving one a reason for action, something that alternately justifies or orients one's decisions in life. It helps to think about the context in which an appeal to reasons for action might come up to bear on one's love. So as G.E.N. Amscombe famously showed, she's a very important action theorist of the 20th century, reasons for action are always implicit in our intentional life whenever we do something. They become explicit, however, when we're challenged in some way to explain why we're doing something, whether the sense of this why is to ask for the point of what we do. Why are you talking right now, Jeremy? Well, to convey some of my recent work. Well, why are you doing that? Well, in order to share learning. And why do that? Well, to live better together. And why that? Well, to help make life good. Notice that initially the reasons for action show how what we are doing is a means to something else that we want to do. Anscombe called this a quote unquote calculative reason. There's nothing sinister about that word. It just means it's useful. But also notice that toward the end of the questioning, the calculative reasons turn into something different, on the order of ethical justifications. Now, Anscombe called these latter things, like because it's good or because it will make life go well, desirability characterizations. As Wittgenstein once wrote at the beginning of his philosophical investigations, explanations must come to an end somewhere. And this somewhere for reasons of action is a conception of the good life or of what we must morally do. So when you challenge me to give my reasons for what I'm doing, I might tell you a further thing that I'm doing because of what I'm doing. So that's calculative. But at the end, eventually, if you keep asking me, well, what's the point? I switch from calculative reasons, means to ends, and I turn into talking about the justifications for my actions in terms of a conception of the good life. That's the thought. And it goes back to Aristotle. It's actually in the first sentences of the Nicomachean Ethics make some argument like that. So when Kolodny claims that love largely consists in finding the relationships we have with those we value appropriately as reasons for action, he means a reason for action in the sense of a desirability characterization, not a calculative reason. He calls it a final valuation. In other words, in love, our relationships are part of the good human life for ourselves, period. They are worthwhile in and of themselves, not as means to some other end. And this sounds true, doesn't it? Well, yes, it does. But the problem is that it is not primarily what love is about. The scene of reason giving is the scene of having to justify why one does what one does. And the idea is that in love, we make space for our relationships by marking them as good in and of themselves. Alternately, the scene of reason using is the scene of deliberation, seeking to orient the decisions we make. And the idea there is that in love, we put our relationships on the horizon, making them some of the waymarks of all that we do. Kolodny's love then is about figuring out how to live or standing up for one's living. But that's not what love primarily is or involves. That's my problem with it, the view. So rather, love is a particular kind of connection with each other. And what it primarily involves is connecting, staying in touch. It isn't primarily about how to act, but how to be. It isn't primarily about justification, it's about relation. The mention of relation may, however, be confusing because Kolodny's talking about love as valuing a relationship. So let me now move to the other half of love as Kolodny sees it. Love is valuing. First of all, to value something is to take it in according to how it ought to be valued. When we engage in science, we value things according to values appropriate to knowledge, for instance, truth, or what my colleague in philosophy, Chris Halfa, who spoke here earlier this semester, sometimes calls in a different context, fruitfulness. When we value art aesthetically, we look for such things as its beauty, complexity, disorienting quality, and so on, depending on the kind of art one appreciates and the mode of judgment that one's using. But in both cases, we evaluate accordingly because doing so is good. It would not be good to approach science looking for profitability rather than truth. That breeds corruption and is not science, but capitalism. It would not be good to approach art looking for an escapist drug. That would breed bad art and would not be aesthetics, but self-soothing. The point is, valuation is grounded in thought about the good. From that ground, we articulate more local values appropriate to the kind of good at hand. The problem, of course, is that thinking of love as seeing one's loved one as a matter of good or bad, and seeing your relationship together as something to be sized up are, at the best, exceptional and problematic moments of love, not love's core. Love is not primarily about valuing each other and your relationship. Instead, love is about meeting each other and being in your relationship. And this is a subtle but crucial point. If we are here valuing each other in our relationship, sizing each other up to reflect what is good about each other and our being together, we are momentarily out of love. We are disconnected from each other and in doubt about each other's worth enough that we find ourselves raising the question of our value together and each on our own. I'm willing to concede to Kolodny that actual love relationships crucially involve such moments of disconnection, that being in love accommodates moments of being out of love. But it does not make sense to me to say that such disconnected moments are the primary stuff of being in love and loving others. The lovers who stop to size each other up have a momentary problem. The loving person who even implicitly is seeing another person as worthy or unworthy is not paying attention to that person. Before being worthy or unworthy, people are. Love lets us be with and see people as they are, not as we value them. So love as valuation makes sense only in moments when we are out of love, but still in love. I want to end this part of the talk by explaining how this might go. Being out of love is different than not loving. When we are out of love, we still refer to love as shaping our world, but we refer to it as something from which we are estranged. People who no longer love each other at all are not out of love, they simply don't love each other anymore. Insofar as we're out of love, we still see the love we had with one another. In such a situation, it makes sense that we might evaluate each other in our relationship. Perhaps in doing so, we will find that it is possible to be in love again without estrangement. The idea here is not that figuring out how we might be good with each other or worthy as people can lead us to love each other. If that were so, we would be mere goods to each other and love would be a transaction. The reason why a moment of practical evaluation in love can be part of love is that the estrangement of practical evaluation in love, the reason why a moment of practical evaluation in love can be a part of love is that the estrangement of practical evaluation allows us to regain our freedom in some measure. In sizing you up, I become free of you for a moment. In being free of you while our love still shapes our world, I become free to relate to you freely again. For this reason, being out of love is an important part of being in love. Being out of love gives us the freedom to renew our relations, without which there is no true love. Okay, section 2. These sections now are shorter. I want to now take a different approach to the topic of today's talk, beginning with another aspect of Kolodny's essay. This is its tacit conventionalism. One of the things that seems to work in the background of Kolodny's view of love is the presumption of conventional relationships. He does not seem to countenance the extent to which love makes relationships that are convention busting and in essence unique to those who are in love. So I want to focus for a short spell on this dimension of Kolodny's essay because doing so brings to the fore the way that love is not practical, but relational. Focus not on the good life, but on connection between people, come what may. A corollary of love's being relational is that its relationships are sui generis in practical terms, generally locatable only through looking at how people meet and stay connected in love. A corollary of that claim, in turn, is that love is not directly moral in its relations. There can, of course, be immoral loves. And that conclusion will set us on a path to ask where, if anywhere, there is a moral core to love. Kolodny early on defines love as, quote, a state that involves caring about a person, end quote. He also broadens love beyond the family and beyond romance to include friends. At one point, he broadens even the romantic, the familial, and the friendly to include, quote, the person with whom I have made my life, end quote. Where the category of making one's life together or sharing one's life might be taken to indicate something quite open to many kinds of conventional descriptions. Still, in almost the same passage, Kolodny emphasizes that his view of love depends on, quote, a relationship that makes caring concern for a person appropriate. In other words, the relationship and its conventions are doing a lot of work to define love by what is, quote unquote, appropriate. The examples Kolodny gives show us what he has in mind. There are two levels to his answer. First, a relationship must be in place. Kolodny speaks of the inappropriateness of thinking he loves a complete stranger simply by caring to help him. A similar problem arises with quote unquote stalkers who claim to love the object of their obsession. The problem in the first instance is that a one-off act of neighborly concern is not a relationship. And the problem in the next instance is that the one who is stalked does not have a relationship with the stalker. Rather, they are subjected to the stalker's objectification. Second, the relationship in love provides what is appropriate and inappropriate to a significant extent. Kolodny speaks of the inappropriateness of mothers who fail to care about their children, nonetheless being thought of as mothers who love their children. While the mother and her children do have a relationship, the problem is that mothers are not doing what the relationship demands in the way of care, and so cannot be thought properly as loving, insofar as they fail to care about their children. Pre-existing exogenous assumptions about relationships determine what love is, rather than love-making relationships. Part of the problem here is that Kolodny conflates not loving well with not loving. The mother who is indifferent to her child during a stretch of life certainly fails to love her child well during that time, unless indifference is what the child needs to grow up. But to claim that she does not love her child at all seems unclear. We need to know more about the qualities of her uncaringness to actually understand whether the problem is not loving well, loving with flaws, having one's love temporarily broken, and so on, or not loving, period. Similarly, the stalker certainly does not share care or love in their obsession over another. But this does not decide the issue of whether they are loving pathologically, and so are at odds with themselves and undermining of what could have once been love, or not loving at all, coldly fixated on a person in a straight up act of power. More needs to be said, and about love. Nor is it clear on reflection that neighborly care cannot be neighborly love. What is the point at which a relation between people becomes a relationship? Is it simply that a relationship demands a history of mutual concern? But then it is impossible to love someone who will not have is it impossible to love someone who will not have a mutual relationship with you? Well, that seems false, if only because love for children often involves one-sided love in the very early days. Is Kolodny going to say that we can love our children only after they are a month or two old? What really needs to happen is that we need to determine how love makes relationships, not vice versa, such that there could be such things as neighborly love as well as love for someone who fails to love you back. But to do that, we need to talk about love on its own without yoking it to conventional relationships that seem arbitrarily curtailed by Kolodny's intuitions. The point is, the way Kolodny ties love to a relationship without exploring love as a relation, and the way Kolodny presumes conventional relationship norms as determining what counts as love and what doesn't count, should send up a red flag, with the color red here being the color of love, not of alarm. And in retrospect, not adequately distinguishing the kind of care in love should add a second flag. It seems that care and appropriate relationships are doing the work of explaining love, but not all cares are loves. When I'm faced by a corrupt and violent official who is utterly incompetent on any philosophical grounds that I've ever studied in moral philosophy, and care about my voice of protest being heard, I do not love my protest, and I do not even love the other officials whom I hope will hear me. The first would be self-righteous and sentimental of me, and the second just isn't true. I don't love those other officials at all, since they shield a corrupt and violent leader. I just hope that they are not utterly corrupt too. I would show some love to them only if I sincerely tried to connect with them. We need to understand what is particular to the care and love to see love, and for that matter, nonviolent protest, which is about connection first. If the answer to that is that the caring about others found in love is specific to certain kinds of relationships, not protest, say, but fatherhood, then we need to understand why some relationships are defining love rather than other relations. And besides, why not vice versa? Why wouldn't the quality of the relations make the relationships that define love? Or more simply, why wouldn't the quality of the relations attest to there being love in them? Kolodny's appeal to a range of conventional relationships that define love in this way, parenthood, marriage, friendship, and so on, does not tell us how these relationships came to be deserving of attesting to love. We should want to know why these relationships are loving, and if they indeed are. We should not want to presume that they give us love when they are, quote unquote, appropriate. Kolodny loses track of love by focusing on conventional relationships and presuming that they illuminate love's core. He should be thinking about how some kinds of conventional relationships are built around or disposed to connection instead. A more beneficial analytical path, it would seem to me, is to explain love's relation to care. For instance, the quality of love's relations, and from there to explain what relationships can be loving, why and how. Perhaps then we might build up a sense of what is a loving relationship and what is appropriate within it on account of love itself, not something exogenous, not from importing conventional understanding that may or may not be loving. How might we proceed in this alternative way to understand the quality of loving relations? Okay, part 3. I hope now my view will start to become clear. A simple proposal comes from outside Kolodny's work. In the simplest terms, the problem with Kolodny's approach is that his understanding of love is tied to practical reason, to the search for the good life, and to decisions about what to do. But while love must deal with all sorts of practical things and is a part of the good life, love itself is not primarily practical. It isn't about deciding, but about being. It isn't about judging what is good and bad, but is about connecting with another in a personal way, even before good and bad and the stance of judgment come into it. No, love isn't practical in the first instance. It is relational. And to understand that takes us to something called relational, not practical reason. So what is relational reason? The distinction between relational, practical, and theoretical reason takes its cue from epistemology. These are classic categories in philosophy. It is commonplace in epistemology to point out that there are several forms of knowledge: knowing that, or theoretical knowledge of beliefs; know-how, or practical knowledge of acts; and knowing personally, sometimes called personal acquaintance. Theory is aimed at truth, practice is aimed at goodness, but relating, personal acquaintance, is aimed at connection. If you want to call that harmony or even a non-aesthetic kind of beauty, go for it. The point is, when I'm involved in knowing a person, I'm not here to manipulate them, to treat them practically or calculatively, nor am I here to know stuff about them, that is, to treat them as an object of intellectual understanding. No, I'm here to be with them, to connect. That's what knowing people, rather than knowing about people or knowing how to deal with people, amounts to. Relational reason seeks relating, although it cannot claim it. That is, in seeking to relate, we must want to be related to in return. That is what seeking connection implies. For the other is not simply an object with whom we are in contact, but a person whom we can meet. Nonetheless, we cannot presume connection, and for that matter, relations that are mutual, because to do so would be to treat the freedom of the other to meet or not to meet us in return as if it were something we could control. It would be narcissistic. Hence, when relating to people not as practical or theoretical objects, but as persons whom we can meet, we must relate on the basis of, not despite, the possibility of unrequited relating, including unrequited love. Moreover, in seeking to relate to others by relating to others, we make relationships possible. Here's why. Relating to another accepts them in advance as a person, not as an object. If I view a person as an object of my understanding, trying to figure them out, I'm treating them theoretically. I want to read them as I would anything in the world. But if I view a person as an object of my designs, trying to make them do something or to fit into my plans, I'm treating them practically. I want to sway them as I would any course of action. Neither of these things are really letting people be people. And neither of these things are about actually connecting with people. But in relating to another, seeking to connect with them, I must in the first instance accept that they are someone of their own free will, so to speak, someone whom I am not here to master cognitively or practically, but who is only a person insofar as I let them relate to me personally, but who is only, insofar as I let them relate to me personally, and I relate to them personally as well. When Kolodny speaks about love making one vulnerable, the reason it does that is not because our plans are exposed, but because we are exposed. We're vulnerable not because our plans are exposed, but because we are exposed, namely in relating personally. Relating to others as people is thus a precondition of a certain kind of care about people, not just any old care. It is a precondition of caring about people personally. If I treat another person as a mere body that needs caring about, as sometimes happens in healthcare, I can be said to care practically for them, but I cannot be said to care about them personally. Think about the case of bad bedside manner. To care about another personally depends on seeking to connect with them as a person. That is, it depends on relating. This distinction in turn goes a long way to explaining the quality of care that Kolodny should be trying to explain so that love is not conflated with care. Here is my proposal then about love. Love is not about valuing a relationship or even caring about another person in a way rendered appropriate by a pre-existing category of relationship with its internal criteria of appropriateness. Rather, love is the quality of connection when that connection is sought with one's whole person. To echo a philosopher with whom Kolodny disagrees, Harry Frankfurt, but actually not that philosopher's view of love as a form of desire, love is the movement of a person toward wholehearted connection. Love is the movement of a person toward wholehearted connection. Wholehearted is Frankfurt's term. There are a few things about this understanding that are significant. First, this understanding allows us to see how some degree of love is likely to be found in much care. For any care that is personal, there will be some love involved in it, since there will be some vulnerable giving of oneself seeking connection. At the same time, care that is merely impersonal will be loveless, something we can certainly imagine in many forms of obligatory care at times, and in situations where we care, but we've lost for the time any inclination to give ourselves personally to it. Burnout. Second, the understanding of love I'm proposing allows us to see how love makes relationships, which relationships are loving, and why love creates unconventional relationships. It is understandable that as people seek wholeheartedly to relate, that they will begin to form a relationship. Let us call, at this point, a loving relation what one person can make in seeking to connect wholeheartedly. Let us call a loving relationship what two or more people do in mutually seeking to connect wholeheartedly, that is, in forming loving relations with each other. Unrequited love is still then love, but it is not a relationship. Rather, it is an unrequited relation, a seeking to connect wholeheartedly that is suspended in the void. Some relationships then are not loving, since they're not made of loving relations in general or at the moment. Moreover, some relationships are loving to a degree and in some ways, but not in others, because in them seeking to connect wholeheartedly is occasional or oblique. In other words, we can then see why some relationships are caring, but not loving, loving to a degree or at times, or thoroughly loving. We can understand how to explain that relationships break into love or have a moment of love in them. And we can understand why it does make sense to speak of love of one's neighbor, even in the absence of a historical relationship. And finally, we can understand why two people might seek to connect outside of conventions and form a loving relationship that is uncategorizable, as has often been the case in history, literature, and art. Okay, section 4. There's obviously a lot more that can be said about love as the movement of a person toward wholehearted connection. But this is just a talk. I want to begin to come to a close by focusing on one interesting aspect of the understanding of love I've put forth here. This is the way that love relates to morality. One of the consequences of understanding love through relational reason is that love becomes oblique to morality. In other words, there can be immoral loves, loving relations that are not moral. There can even be loving relationships that are immoral. Take Petra von Kant in Rainer Maria Fassbender's The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, Die bitteren Tränen der Petra von Kant, 1972. The plot of the film unfolds around the narcissistic and sadomasochistic Petra, unraveling as she increasingly seeks to connect wholeheartedly with Karen, a manipulative and shallow user who stands to benefit from Petra's attention. There is no doubt that Petra and Karen lack a loving relationship. In fact, Petra's unraveling can be seen in accordance with her trying to relate in an increasingly loving way as the reality of the unloving relationship rises into view. What is surprising, however, is that the vain, sadistic, and narcissistic Petra does start to relate lovingly. As she does, her sadism turns to masochism, and she becomes increasingly lost, losing her perpetual control over others' wills that narcissists attempt pathologically. Petra's narcissism is broken by love, something that actually enables her to glimpse relationships between people. But one would be hard-pressed to describe Petra's relating as particularly moral. It's confused and chaotic, melodramatic and self-destructive. It does not in any obvious way lead her to respect the moral claims of other people. At the most, it predisposes her to seeing that relationships between people depend on a moral moment. But she does not realize that moment, except for one brief instance, possibly at the end of the film, when she tries to be on the level with her servant, Marlene. But Marlene won't have it, being masochistic herself and needing Petra's manipulative sadism, and the chance for moral growth then evaporates within seconds. Moreover, there is hardly a conventional category for what amounts to Petra's loving relation. And that's part of the point too. Love is unconventional in essence because it is concerned with seeking to connect, not with doing what one is supposed to be doing practically, including with what morality demands. There is a tension that is possible between love and morality, love and convention. Now you can see this tension also in the fictionalized historical characters Bonnie and Clyde, the murderous bank robbers in the film that bear their name from 1967. They have a loving relationship, but it is predicated off of lawlessness, theft, and murder. Love between them depends on immorality. They seek to connect wholeheartedly in the wickedness and defiance of their vice. To say that they thus exemplify the conventional category of doomed lovers is saying too little. The point is that since love is primarily a matter of relating, it can come apart from morality. What Bonnie and Clyde do is to exploit that tension, making it a basis for their loving relationship. As such, Bonnie and Clyde have a loving relationship that is careless and made of defying morality to the point of abandon. This may at first seem extremely counterintuitive since we hear care when we hear love very often. But as I've argued, care comes apart from love conceptually and in actuality. And we must, I think, make room for seeing what is potentially perverse and amoral about love, even if in seeking to connect with someone wholeheartedly, love should be inclined to deeper personalization, and thus something that will strike many of us as being consistent with the best that care is about and the heart of morality's focus on persons. The point is, though, love need not go that far. Someone's wholehearted seeking to connect may be lawless and immoral, and this may work for another person too, if that is how they seek to connect as well. Okay, a short last section now, which is on wonder. What was put into the title of the talk. So is there then no moral core to love? The last thing I want to say today is what is found within the talk's title. You've waited over 30 minutes for that title. And so I want to briefly state how love is related to morality, not as necessarily being moral, but as having a potentially moral core that is both important for being able to love fully and is possible to develop so as to see how loves can become moral, even if they needn't be so. To make my case depends on a detour into the work of Martha C. Nussbaum, who's thought a lot about love. In her book, Upheavals of Thought, from 2001, which is Nussbaum's great book about the structure of ethics and the emotions, one of the core questions is how people develop in emotionally healthy ways. At the center of Nussbaum's book is the question of what it takes to become a person who can be open-hearted in their relations because they're capable of being vulnerable. Given Nussbaum's study of psychology and of literature and her own experience as a parent, she claims that becoming a person who's capable of relating wholeheartedly and so is capable of loving relationships depends on being held and seen as an infant, or on working through the absence of touch and recognition later in life. Being held when one needs it at an early age and being seen when one is not self-conscious, but awash in the world's vague push and pull of affects amounts to caretakers loving you. Connected with as a person before you're even formed as one, you feel the safety and the pull to be drawn out into the world where your personality matters. The holding and being seen provides security, yes. And within that, they also provide a space for you to unfold as a nascent person. This unfolding, in turn, depends on being able to slip outside the bindings of one's narcissistic anxiety that seeks to control the world overwhelmingly out of one's control, and to then access a deeper form of what I call positive anxiety that lets the possibilities of others and of the world come to light on their own. In a book I'm currently writing, I explore how we should see that one basic challenge in all our relations is to get beyond the narcissistic anxiety of an insecure self so as to find the more basic anxiety that makes what happens to us matter at all. I'm arguing about positive anxiety in this new book. This more basic anxiety is positive, for it begins by acknowledging the overflow of sense and meaning in the world, something without which we could not be negatively anxious for what we could lose at all. Positive anxiety is an excitement created by the sense and meaning which we're free to consider when we're secure and free to connect with others and the world. The question is how, in the midst of overwhelming vulnerability, to access the underlying positive anxiety of our meaningful and sense-making condition. In simple terms, Nussbaum thinks that the combination of security and being connected with is the most original mode of access for children. Being held and being seen are important for freeing up the child's, what he calls, original joy in wondering about the meaning and sense of the world, including how to relate to it. It strikes me that the part of love involving morality is found in the way that loving care helps a child to get in touch with their power to relate to others freely. Kolodny is right that parents, he focuses on mothers, but fathers matter here as well, have a moral reason to care for their children. The children have a moral right to be cared for. What is special to this care is that children need love within it, need to be connected with in a way that allows them to be secure and free in that connection. This need is a need of their person. Without being held and being seen, it's harder for children to unfold and to seek meaning and sense in the world. It strikes me that love's moral core, if there is any, is found before one becomes a person. In the love one must receive to some degree in order to become a person who can relate to other people wholeheartedly. Before one can connect wholeheartedly, it helps to be connected with. One can internalize that connection. And there are conditions here: to be held and to be seen, to feel that one is secure, and to find that one is sought out, searched for, that others have wanted to see you and have seen you. Nussbaum suggests that only in internalizing that experience of having one's relational needs met can one be disposed to relate freely to others and to let the world appear according to the mind's original joy at considering its amazing possibilities. The internalized experience of being loved and cared for frees up the mind to wonder and oneself to connect in return. The negative anxiety of narcissistic worry over whether one can trust in or control the wills of others in the face of the threatening senselessness and meaninglessness of the world at times gives way to the positive anxiety of finding that the world is a place where others can be met, where relating is amazing, and where sense and meaning overflow. Moreover, in relating to and with others, the capacity to wonder about them in security is part and parcel of letting them appear in their own light, just as they are, and not as you wish them to be. To be able to connect our positive anxiety with others is to let them be free to connect. So when one is loved and thus learns to love, one does bring something moral along with one's love, at least as a potential. One does not bring with one obligation, the distinctive mark of morality, but what brings with one what it is to see, that is to connect with another person, letting them be in their possibilities. This is a moral potential that comes along with the moral core of love found within having been loved as a child, to the point of being secure in one's original joy. The moral potential provided by being loved is not sufficient for morality, and it's also not necessary, but it is important for it. So important indeed that it is hard to imagine how people deprived of the memory of being held and being seen are in a good position to recognize and be in touch with others when they morally must. Since, however, we're dealing with psychologies and their contingencies, and people are incredibly powerful and resourceful, and I'm only doing philosophy here, not social science, I'm going to leave empirical generalizations up to others, and I can already think of some counterexamples. It may be possible to morally recognize other people absent a history of being connected with. but it strikes me as a challenge. That's the more modest claim, to be surmounted. Being loved as a child or working through the absence of childhood love later in life isn't necessary for being moral, but it sure helps. Love internalized at the origins of our personal development can dispose people to morality if only other aspects of their character can obtain. Moreover, even later in life, loving someone truly should deepen one morally, provided that one realizes how all people deserve to be seen in some way, as one has come to really see another person and to be able to connect with them in love. All right, thank you very much. And I just want to thank for this talk a reading group that I had earlier with Matt Furcani at Michigan State, Ursula Lizowska in Poland, and Alexei Tarasenko-Struk